My hopes about this talk, if nothing else, it leaves you with a sense maybe that you haven't lived much longer than you might have otherwise. So we're living longer. Can you all hear me, by the way? All right. Okay. This is Madame Jeanne Calment. She lived to be 121 years old. She passed away in 1997. She didn't just age well, she maintained an active lifestyle. She began fencing. She started to learn fencing at the age of 85. She was still riding her bicycle at 100. And this is my favorite. She quit smoking at 120. She quit because she could no longer light the cigarette herself, and she valued her autonomy. At 121, she released her first and last rap CD. And her secret for a long life, she was interviewed, every year for about 30 years. Her secret for long life was port wine and chocolate. So something to think about, something to write down. There recently has been some concern about the authenticity of her birth certificate, but it's still pretty amazing. She without any doubt, she lived into her hundreds and maintained an active lifestyle. Yes, we're living longer, right? These are some of the boring statistics: 81 and 76 for females and males, respectively, for those who were born in 2000. Compare this with 1900, where life expectancies hovered around 50 years. Now, most of these gains have come through the reduction of the infant mortality rate, effective treatment of acute illnesses, improved general sanitation and hygienic practices. But we've also seen the advent of something else, and that is periods of decline and decay and decrepitude, and the increasing incidences of age-related diseases, Alzheimer's, dementia, heart disease. I think it was one of the president's commissions on bioethics that did a study on aging. I cite something from that later. They used this language of being on the verge of a mass geriatric society, where those 85 years and older represent the fastest growing segment of our population. I want to be careful with graphs. They can be misleading, not always helpful, but this gives you some idea of what has happened in the last 100 years. From 1900 to 2010, the number of the population of those 65 and older has jumped from 3 to 13 million. And that represents a percentage increase from 1% back in 1900 to just over 12% back in 2010. Some other alarming statistics from the Alzheimer's impact movement. It's no secret that increased longevity continues to strain an already overburdened healthcare system. The number of Americans with Alzheimer's is expected to rise from 4 million in 2005 to 13.8 in 2050. The expenditures there, you can see 206 billion roughly in 2020 is expected to balloon to 584 billion in the next 27 years. And so here is what the President's Council on Bioethics had to say when they were in existence in a work entitled "Taking Care." And this isn't rocket science. This has been well observed in our society. Longer lifespans increase the likelihood now of a prolonged decline. The average American will spend about 2 years in a period of what is called a significant state of decline or disability before death. And the most common chronic illness trajectory, and there have been studies on this, would say that a slow, prolonged decline is going to continue to be the norm. The Rand Corporation did a study a few years ago entitled Living Well at the End of Life. Crazy, it's already 20 years old, this study. But they do a large breakdown into what they call typical chronic illness trajectories. 20 years ago, 20% roughly of all deaths could have this type of somewhat sudden decline, typically due to the onset of some diagnosis like cancer. But there is also the other, another more steady decline that granted, there's not numbers on the baseline here. So these are big picture ideas, but we can see that the gradual loss of function over time, in increasing incidences or hospitalizations that may involve slightly longer stays and more serious procedures before perhaps being allowed to go back home. And then at some point, we're all heading toward that final precipitous drop off there, known as death. 40%, however, are projected to be this even slower decline, mostly frailty and dementia. Again, rather vague language, but we can see the picture, and it isn't bright or certainly encouraging. This is from the President's Council on Bioethics, again, from that same work, Taking Care. They say the defining character of our time seems to be that we are both younger longer and older longer. We're more vigorous at ages that once seemed very old, and we are far more likely to suffer protracted periods of age-related disability and dependence because we live to ages that few people reached in the past. We're both younger, longer, and older, longer. Some other interesting statistics from the same study: curing all forms of cancer would increase lifespan by at most 2 to 3 years. So it is widely thought and accepted that if we want to live much longer, healthier lives, going after diseases is only going to get us so far. What we ought to do, say some scientists and researchers, is to go after the aging process itself. Now that in one respect, there's a little new here under the sun. I mean, long life has always been attractive, all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, through fountain legends, potable gold, all kinds of whacked out attempts to live longer. But it's also this desire to live longer has also been it's been making inroads into legitimate science. It's no longer considered purely science fiction. But when I was at the University of Edinburgh, and I was working on my PhD there, which meant, at least in Europe, that there's no coursework. So you need to come up with a topic. And so I had spent 8 months reading on death, and had yet to come up with a topic. And so this was actually suggested to me by Ben Mitchell, and I thought, well, this is a sure path to destruction and burnout, because who in their right mind is going to do a thesis on something that's science fiction? So nevertheless, I thought that the flip side of that equation is, since you have to, in theory, offer a contribution to knowledge, if nobody has really said anything about life extension through science, then it's really not that hard to make a contribution. So I took the risk. Anyway, back then there were articles like slowing aging from legend to laboratory, but still most people said, stay away from that. It is science fiction. However, we have the advent of the LDIC, the Longevity Dividend Initiative Consortium. They should have gone for a better name. It's founded by epidemiologists, gerontologists, economists, and others who are devoted to understanding the human aging process in order to slow it down, because there's a wide recognition that our healthcare system is collapsing. And so this is some of the material they published. This is from S.J. Olshansky, Miller, and Butler in Search of the Longevity Dividend. They say aging has emerged as a primary risk factor. Well, that seems to make sense. The longer we live, the greater the influence aging has on disease expression. Aging science has a tremendous upside. It can be far more effective than going after individual diseases, and it represents a new paradigm of prevention in public health. Getting funding continues to be tricky, but they're gaining ground. So this is right out of this is from S.J. Olshansky. Bear with me. This is a bit of a longer quote. But he says, research in the scientific study of aging has already showed that the aging of our bodies is inherently modifiable. And that, note the language there, a therapeutic intervention that slows aging in people is a plausible target for science and public health. Right now, aging is not considered a disease, so that can be a problem for funding. But given the speed with which population aging is progressing and chronic, fatal, and disabling conditions are challenging healthcare costs across the globe, the case is now being made in the scientific literature that delayed aging could be one of the most efficient and promising ways to combat disease, extend healthy life, compress morbidity, and reduce healthcare costs. This slowing aging may be the holy grail of healthcare. Olshansky also said this: it's only a matter of time before science acquires the same level, before aging science acquires the same level of prestige and confidence that medicine and public health now enjoy. And when that time comes, a new era in human health will emerge. We also have the advent of gerontology, which is the study of the processes associated with aging. And among gerontologists, there are, among those who see slowing aging as a laudable goal, there are typically two competing paradigms. And the first one is often called the compressed morbidity approach. And it's also, the tagline is usually adding life to one's years. So, I mean, and if we're honest with ourselves, if we make it to 85 or 90, most of us would like to be really, really vigorous, maybe, take up fencing or something, and then get really sick and pass away within a month. That's somewhat attractive. And admittedly, there's so much not known that no one really knows whether or not that's even possible. Like, okay, even if we can slow aging, are we going to compress morbidity, or is it possible that we might actually extend the period of decline? No one knows. The other alternative is just flat out get control over aging and let's try to live to 150 or 200 and then still die quickly. But that is the adding years to life strategy. And then there are more radical forms like Aubrey de Grey, who there's this acronym SENS. He coined that 15 years ago or so. Strategies for engineering negligible senescence, which is just a fancy word for aging. There are some like de Grey who believe that we will make enough advances scientifically in understanding and modulating aging that we'll be able to kind of piecemeal continue to live as long as we want. So say we stumble on some genetic therapy that gives us 2 or 3 more decades. Well, that's 2 or 3 more decades to keep doing research to develop the next bit of technology that might give us a century or more, and so on. There have been lots of successes in the laboratory. So it is spawning a lot of hope that some of these techniques that have been successful in nematode worms and fruit flies and mice will actually be effective for us. This is a smattering, right? So there's known as the DAF, the DAF2 and DAF16 alterations, genetic alterations have doubled the healthy lifespan of nematode worms. And other gene mutations have produced a 7-fold increase in healthy life from 31 days to 100 days. Now, granted, we're dealing with worms who have a short lifespan and are not nearly as complex as humans. Michael Rose developed a selective breeding with fruit flies based on principles of evolutionary biology. And he has, through selective breeding, engineered fruit flies that live 3 to 4 times longer than normal fruit flies. And supposedly their vigor remains intact. I don't actually know how you measure fruit fly vigor, but there is a measurement for that. And he also, for what it's worth, and I mean, this one's not practical at all, but he observed that if you refrigerate fruit flies, they live longer. And there's some evidence with living in colder climates that might help us age more efficiently. But more recently, Harvard scientists have reversed the signs of aging in very old mice with what's known as telomerase therapy. Telomeres are these unencoded tips on the DNA strands in cells. And when cells reproduce and multiply, over time, the telomeres become shorter and shorter to the point where the cells can no longer multiply. That's what's been happening here is that through this adding, again, this is way more technical than I'm qualified to talk about, but the telomeres have been restored and enhanced, and they have allowed cells to replicate longer than what is normal. I mean, most somatic cells have a limit, right? It's called the Hayflick limit. The flip side and the trick there is that when you allow these telomeres to allow cells to continually to divide, they start to mimic cancer. Anyway, there you go. I'll say a few more things. Caloric restriction mimetics is quite interesting, and this is again based on a supposed discovery by Clive McKay back in the 1930s, where if you feed mice less than a 30 to 50% reduced diet, they live longer. Less food, less food, less oxidative stress, less DNA repair. Dr. Garrente at MIT has singled out some genes that mimic caloric restriction. So, I mean, talk about a world market coming to your doorstep, losing weight without having to change your diet, living longer without actually having to, pay attention to your body. Keep the Oreo double stuff coming. Sorry, that's my weakness. It spawned a whole field of known as caloric restriction mimetics. And here's just a couple of examples. A healthy lifespan of mice extended by 70% using a combination of CR, caloric restriction, and genetic engineering. The search is on for a Methuselah pill to produce these effects not only in mice and worms and flies, but one day in humans. There have been some other more recent studies on the benefits of rapamycin. This drug has been out for a while. I'm trying to remember if it's, I don't want to confuse that with metformin. Anyway, this principle or this compound has been used with healthy patients and has shown to have rejuvenating factors. There's several pharmaceutical companies, Novartis is one of them, using other similar compounds to measure and slow down cellular aging. And they measure that through epigenetic clocks, et cetera. There's the metformin study, TAME, targeting aging through metformin. Metformin is a long approved, FDA approved drug, I think 60 years now, used to treat diabetes. But a study of more than 41,000 metformin users between the ages of 68 and 81 showed a significant reduction in the likelihood or onset of dementia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, frailty, and depression. And more recently, there was a group study with a group of subjects who took metformin for 9 years, and they showed a reduction in dementia, depression, cardiovascular disease. And a more recent study of healthy volunteers showed that the age of the blood cells, as measured by DNA methylation, was actually reversing within 1 week of a single 850 milligram dose of metformin. Senolytics is another promising pathway. Sometimes cells, when they've reached their replicating limit, they fail to go through their death sequence properly as apoptosis, and they're known as zombie cells. And zombie cells create inflammation and they contribute to aging. So Senolytics is aimed at cleaning out those zombie cells at the tissue level to help preserve our human bodies. There's also dasatinib and quercetin. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Dasatinib is a chemotherapy drug, and quercetin is a molecule found in capers, kale, and red onions. There have been some studies done recently with those who are taking these orally. In fact, for 1 year, there's a group of 9 men. I don't know why there were no women in this study, but 9 men who took 2 growth hormone medications in conjunction with metformin and a powerful caloric restriction mimetic. And they found that when they applied this to mice, they saw that again, they saw signs of reversing aging, which is far more dramatic than they had ever hoped to see. Anyway, I could continue to multiply these, and I don't know how helpful that will be, but nevertheless, it's hard to stop. And I wanted to this is the latest. This was published in Cell magazine or Cell journal, I'm sorry, just last month. Scientists here have managed to reverse aging in mice. They're called ICE mice. It stands for induced changes to the epigenome mice. And so what they've done is that they've managed to make the mice age more rapidly without introducing mutations. In fact, they term it as faithful DNA repair. That's part of the aging process, faithful DNA repair. So they were, if you're able to fast forward aging in mice, it's a good way to study whether or not that process can be reversed. And lo and behold, they discovered through the use of 3 different Yamanaka factors. There's a 4th factor that wasn't used. And I don't think we need to go into that level of detail. But what they've recently published is they measured several benchmarks for aging in these mice after these factors, these genetic factors, were applied. And they noted that there was a 57% roughly reversal in cellular age. So this just wasn't slowing aging down. This was at a cellular level, and also phenotypically, just through looking at the mice, looking at their eyes that were clouded over, and then they become clearer again. Shocking changes. David Sinclair says, he's one of the lead researchers. I've been really surprised by how universally it works. We haven't found a cell type yet that we can't age forward and backward. This is right from that study. Our data are consistent with aging in mammals being the equivalent, interesting metaphors here, of a software problem, the result of corrupted epigenetic information that can be restored from an existing backup copy. It is now apparent that mammals retain a backup copy of youthful epigenetic information that can safely restore the function of old tissues, akin to reinstalling software. They're basically able to take these cells and make them kind of, well, age in reverse. Time magazine recently offered their take on this same study. So it's interesting. Here's David Sinclair again. These words are both exciting and chilling at the same time. He says, we just don't understand how rejuvenation really works, but we know it works. We can use it to rejuvenate parts of the body. Now, when I see an older person, I don't look at them as old. I just look at them as someone whose system needs to be rebooted. It's no longer a question of if rejuvenation is possible, but a question of when. That's kind of interesting. Yes, there's been a whole, just go to Amazon and type in anti-aging, slowing aging. This is just a random sampling. These continue to proliferate. And also National Geographic is getting in on this as well. Their January 2023 issue is dedicated to living longer and better, and they've got an entire 25-page article on slowing aging. And this fellow here, I think, is in his mid-80s, and I guess he's kind of one-upping Jean Calment. I guess skydiving is probably, I don't know, that's pretty incredible. Fencing seems kind of tame compared to that. Just one more example, because they keep coming. This is how to be 18 years old again for only $2 million a year. This is a title that was just released in Business Week, and it features the life of Brian Johnson. I mean, he's 45 years old, and I mean, you got to admit he's like pretty ripped. He's an ultra wealthy software engineer, and I'm just now seeing this connection. He actually consumes exactly 1,977 calories a day. And I suspect that it's all vegan, right? And he supplements with metformin and other vitamins. He brushes his teeth with a water pick and flosses before rinsing with tea tree oil. And he has a team of 30 doctors who are monitoring numerous functions in his body, but he has the gum inflammation of a 17-year-old. That's every time I go to the dentist, I'm reminded of my poor flossing habits, or non-existent. So his doctors, they say, well, he's got the heart of a 37-year-old, which isn't bad since he's 45, the skin of a 28-year-old, and the lung capacity of an 18-year-old. They track 10 or more different measurements of each of his organs. He boasts that he has taken, how many can boast of this? 33,537 images of his bowels, again, for research. And he blasts his pelvic floor with electromagnetic pulses to improve muscle tone in hard to reach places. He has also started the Rejuvenation Olympics. Yeah, I don't know if you can read. Yeah, the top 20 largest age reversals out of 1,750 people, validated phenotypically by phenotypically trained epigenetic methylation algorithms. If that doesn't sound official, I don't know what is. And no surprise, right now he's leading the pack. He is gold medal status. Okay, that's enough about that. I'm running out of time and haven't really said anything. How does this impact how we think about aging? I think this conceptual distance between aging and disease continues to shrink. And we find more researchers who are basically saying, look, we need to consider aging itself as a disease. We have a new addition, gerontologophobia. These are people who are afraid of any kind of anti-aging technology. And I think it's clear that our aging body is increasingly being viewed as our adversary. A couple of researchers here, Walter Longo is these are not quacks. He is the Edna M. Jones Professor of Gerontology and Biological Sciences and the Director of the Longevity Institute at UCLA. The body is an army of cells at war. That may be one apt description, but can we say something more? David Sinclair is an Australian biologist, professor of genetics, and director of the Paul F. Glenn Center for the Biology of Aging at Harvard Medical School. Accepting our biological limitations is unnatural. Aging is a disease. Yeah, Aristotle flirted with calling aging a long time ago, but eventually rejected that notion. And Galen also said, no, aging's not a disease. It's not contrary to our nature. This is out of David Sinclair's book, Why We Age. I found this it's real telling. Spend a day in a nursing home, like my wife does every few days. Go feed people who can't chew. Wipe their bottoms, bathe them with a sponge, watch as they struggle to remember where they are and who they are. When you are done, I think you will agree that it would be negligent and cruel for you not to do what you can do to combat your own age-related deterioration. When Sinclair, in his book, reflected on his own grandmother, he was hardly able to conceal his disdain for her stoic resignation to the inevitable. And after watching her succumb to frailty and finally die, he offers this chilling assessment. He said, and I'm quoting now, "The person she truly was had been dead many years." So we have 17 minutes. How are Christians to think about aging and slowing it down? Real quickly, what I'm going to do now is give you hopefully a streamlined synopsis of my book, and trying to keep it interesting. When I was looking at this quest to slow aging, I stumbled on the work of Francis Bacon, which it was interesting in his use of Christian theology and biblical metaphors to argue for a new kind of science, a science that aims at instrumental knowledge, not expansive theoretical knowledge that tells us how the world works, but knowledge that we can put to use. And keep in mind, he's writing here in the late 1500s. He saw slowing aging as the most noble goal of medicine. So he's well ahead of his time. And it's interesting, he drew on Eden before the fall as a metaphor. Science will enable us to regain Eden. And what does he mean by that? Well, restoring our place of sovereignty and power over nature, the kind of sovereignty and power that Adam and Eve had, although to be fair, he probably just thought that was Adam's power over nature. And this led to lots of things are going on here in terms of scientific method, et cetera. But Bacon was part of this two books doctrine where he argued, let the Bible deal with things like formal and final causes, like why we are here, how the world works. Let the second book be the book of nature. Let us investigate that along the lines of efficient causes and material causes. This is Aristotelian language, but it's basically a plea for making science more practical and getting the ethereal stuff out of it. Even while, as he makes these arguments, he's drawing on biblical and theological imagery. So he was sharply critical of Aristotle. Again, I've just mentioned this, namely the dominance of final and formal causes. Final causes ask questions like, what is this for? What's a tree for? Modern science says, who cares? Let's see what it is and find out how it works so we can put it to our own use. So he was sharply critical of those who wanted the big picture and likened them to seeking knowledge on a couch, rather than using knowledge to build a rich storehouse. Note the language here again, for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. So his plea is construction over contemplation. Knowledge for construction over just contemplating how the world works. Yeah, we're not going to read anymore. We'll say one more thing here. This is just, again, a brief snapshot of his understanding of how this new scientific method will uncover mechanisms of aging and allow us to live a long time, if not forever. And therefore, it is not the pleasure of curiosity. Again, that's kind of a throwing shade at Aristotle, but it is a restitution and a reinvesting in great part of man to the sovereignty and power which he had in his first state of creation, Adam before the fall. And to speak plainly and clearly, it is a discovery of all operations and all possibility of operations from immortality, if it were possible, to the meanest mechanical practice. And so it's no surprise that several contemporary bioethicists have dubbed what we're doing today, and I think we could call aging aging research, part of this Baconian project, Alan Verhey, in this just wonderful little book, Nature and Altering It. He says, look, this is the narratives of salvation. And he's right. In the myth of the Baconian project, nature is the enemy. Our aging bodies are the enemy. Nature may be and must be mastered. It may be and must be altered. In this myth, technology becomes the faithful savior. Gerald McKinney has summarized the Baconian project with two principles, the elimination of suffering and the expansion of choice. And McKinney asks that wonderful theological and Aristotelian question about purpose. What's the body for? The Baconian project, he notes, not only replaces attitudes and practices regarding the moral significance of the body, its pursuit of health and its susceptibility to disease, decay, and death, but it is itself a set of attitudes and practices regarding the body, and one that is pervasive in our self-formation. We can't engage in these exercises, these scientific exercises and disciplines without being shaped in some way, is what McKinney is saying, or seems to be saying. And the assumptions, I think, are here. A healthy body is a prerequisite to everything else you want that's good in life. At best, our bodies are neutral. Any kind of suffering is always inimical or hostile to flourishing. And that the body and soul, if indeed there is a soul, I mean, that's antiquated, like religious language, although it's also ancient philosophical language. But the body and soul really don't have much to do with one another. If anything, it's our wills and passions and desires that rule over our bodies. So that was part of my research in Edinburgh. And I have to credit, like, my entire PhD hung on a meeting with a retired history professor at the University of Edinburgh when I was really struggling, and he said, "Hey, you ought to check out Athanasius and early ancient asceticism because there were strands of longevity preaching there, which I found fantastic and amazing." And I don't know, anytime you can bring the church fathers into a contemporary bioethical discussion, I think that is unequivocally a good thing. So Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, he wrote this short work called The Life of Saint Anthony, who he heralded as an example for Christians to follow. Anthony himself fled to the North African desert. Long story short, he treated his body harshly. He fought off demons, fasted and prayed, and tried to live alone, and kept drawing followers and kept drawing further into the desert. But he lived to 105 years of age and seemed to be really largely healthy right before he expired. And Athanasius didn't stop there. He unpacked what Anthony was trying to do. And long story short, he saw slowing human aging as an inevitable byproduct of a spiritual practice of realigning one's soul to God and one's body to one's soul. I know that's kind of it's a reordering, if you will. So he taught, of course, Adam and Eve are finite beings. They were created as finite beings, but he saw this reordering of the body and the soul, where the soul was in fellowship with God, and the desires of the body that waged war against the soul, desires for power, for sex, for food. Once those were brought under control, the body itself benefited. And in Athanasian language, Anthony began to reapproach Eden before the fall. He was becoming Adam. this, sin is what led to the disruption of the body and the soul. And accelerated aging was the result. So here's like, this is much more complicated. I mean, now we've just said something theological, and I don't know how in the world you measure how sin impacts aging, unless you just look at harmful lifestyles like obesity or alcoholism. So in Athanasian theology, this is known as he subsumed this under theosis. And again, this is be kind of problematic. It's often misunderstood. Becoming divine is one poor translation, but the idea is participating in the divine nature, right? This is what 2 Peter was quoted here, and it's tied to a view of the atonement. It's very Eastern, that basically sees atonement not only as the cross, but also as the incarnation. Like when the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, took on human nature in Jesus Christ, personal union, two natures, somehow humanity itself, human nature itself has been to some degree restored. How? Well, they never really tell us explicitly. I mean, there are hints at things like fasting and prayer and the Eucharist are a way that the incarnation, the life of Christ is made new in us. The tagline here, Christ was made man that we might be made God. This was not unique to Athanasius, by the way. I mean, a couple hundred years earlier, Origen and Irenaeus said the same thing, reflecting on Peter. And so Athanasius says, look, Anthony he's like our poster boy for becoming renewed through the incarnation and taking on those practices that reorder the body and soul and help his body live longer, like Adam in the garden before sin. Okay, we're getting close. Bear with me. So Christ's incarnation involves some transformation of the flesh. Attenuated aging, yeah, much longer life is possible, but there's also this recognition that Christ rose from the dead, so we ought to expect to die at some point, and we look forward to the resurrection. So the ethical aspects of theosis were fasting to quiet the bodily desires, and that this once you quiet the desires of the body, you are able to have a more intimate fellowship with Christ. I think Peter Brown says it very eloquently. He comments on this and says the ascetic had to learn over the long years of life in the desert to do nothing less than to untwist the very sinews of his private will. Fasting and heavy labor were important in their own right. And once the florid symptoms of greed and sexual longing associated with the ascetic's past habits had subsided, he was brought face to face with the baffling closedness of his own heart. It was to the heart and to the strange resilience of the private will that the great tradition of spiritual guidance associated with the Desert Fathers directed its most searching attention. The byproduct of this was slowing aging. So this is, I'm summarizing, 75 pages into a PowerPoint slide. Fasting aging effected a return to Eden. This was spoken of in language of reordering the body and soul so that the soul was the rightful ruler over the body, as it was with Adam before the fall. Aging attenuation is enhanced by fasting. Anthony, again, is the model figure. So fasting is subsumed under, but yet integral to refining one's inner life. So, yeah, I can't defend this now, but this was not motivated by a hatred of the body, though there's no shortage of examples among the desert ascetics where you find this kind of torture of the body, because it is, it flirts with dualism and Gnostic thought, Manichaeism, just another early thought where the body is evil. But the positive side of this is that character formation requires attending to the body. And then finally, body and soul were likened to two sides of the ladder by which we ascend to the ladder of humility. Or, sorry, not the ladder of humility, is it? Yes. So this became like a helpful paradigm with which to critique and look at contemporary attempts to slow human aging through caloric restriction mimetics, kind of like a shortcut to maybe seeing the body as both worthy of care and also the locus for the development of spiritual practices. So it made sense to me at the time to reflect on the second Adam, the last Adam. This is Paul in 1 Corinthians, and in Romans 5. And here I wanted to say something more Christological, because I mean, it's hard to refer to prelapsarian Eden and get much out of that, although the Desert Fathers certainly did. But if we want to say something Christian, then like, what a radical idea to like say something about Christ. So I relied on the theology of Karl Barth, and again, we're running out of time here, but I will. I'm going to do this scandalously quickly. Barth was just a remarkable theologian for several reasons, but one of his hallmark contributions was his look at Christology and saying, we don't look at our human nature and then project that onto the human nature of Christ, right? That's completely backwards. Rather, when we look at Jesus as attested in Scripture, that becomes our template for what it means for us to be human. Now, granted, those lines are not always easy to draw, but he concluded that since the biblical witness to the life of Jesus seems to say that he aged, that he grew up and developed and then aged and ate and drank and slept and defecated, that it is proper for us humans to eventually grow old and die. That's a happy thought. But he also recognized that since we are created to be God's covenant partners and God is eternal, that there is this proper desire for us to live a really, really, really long time. And that there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. He even says, he asks rhetorically, what but an unlimited permanent duration can be adequate for the fulfillment of this determination, that is to be God's covenant partner. So on the other hand, if we look at the life of Jesus as determining for what it means for us to be human, then finitude has to be part of it. So he looked at Jesus, and I love this, that he used the same body-soul language, which I think made a nice parallel with the work of Athanasius. And he too spoke of a Christian dualism, if you will, with a proper order, where the soul is the rightful ruler over the body as its servant. And he says, if you want to see an example of this, look at the life of Jesus, whose soul was in perfect subjection to God, and this soul was also the perfect ruler of his body. So I love this part too. So I think it's incredible. So Barth describes sin, or defines sin, in terms of the normativity of Jesus. And he's got several subheadings. So I'm looking at just a couple. The German is utterly probably unhelpful, but he noted that there are, given what we know of the life of Jesus, there's two that are notable. The first is the sin of sloth. Sloth is not laziness. In fact, sloth is the inability to be still and to attend with what really matters. And he said, based on the life of Jesus, it manifests itself in a couple of ways. First, in dissipation. And by that, he means a messed up relationship between the body and the soul. And it manifests itself with respect to time as anxiety. So on the one hand, he says, yeah, we ought to want to live a really long time because we want a eternal relationship with God who, as a covenant partner. On the other hand, he says, if you're anxious about the span of your life, that's a sure sign that your body and soul are out of whack and that you're sinning. Here's his language, and I've got like just 6 or 7 more slides, so bear with me. It gets dangerous to have lengthy block quotes this late into. So in Trogheit, in sloth, I love his language here. The body and soul begin to go their separate ways. His soul will no longer control his body, nor his body obey his soul. The two not only contradict one another in their mutual relationship, but also refusing their distinct functions in this relationship, contradict their own essence as the two integrated elements of human nature. So he's not a pure dualist. He would use this cumbersome language of embodied soul and ensouled body. But if the dissipated man wills, as he does, to be without spirit, he has entered on the irresistible way on which he will finally be soulless and bodilyless, the way which can only lead to death. Sorry, it's hard not to quote Bart. He goes on. So he says, we do one of two things. Either we relive our soul or we relieve our soul of its role as ruler and guardian and preserver of our body in pursuit of a spiritual or inward life, or by releasing our body from its service to our soul, allowing it to pursue its own impulses and needs. In practice, and I think this holds true, our lives are marked by a perpetual hovering between these two possibilities, often engaging in both simultaneously, driven by the illusion that releasing the soul from its responsibility to the body, or vice versa, the body's servitude to the soul, is the pathway to liberation. In reality, however, these choices are nothing but what he calls a twofold docetism, a choosing of the flesh. It's basically saying it's an ethereal, it's not real. It has nothing behind it. So looking at the other, sin as anxiety, he says this, Sorge is the German, another word, it would be just care. He sees us as a disruption of the right relationship of man to his temporality. And his descriptions are quite eloquent. Our allotted duration of life becomes unbearable. And it often takes the form of frenetic, ceaseless activity, including our quest for longer life. I can't help but think that if Bart were around today, he would be throwing that term around to describe what I spent too much time talking about earlier tonight. But he says this, there is no infinite to satisfy our infinite desires, but this something which the dissipated man who has broken loose from the unity and totality of soul and body in which God has created him for existence in the limit of his time cannot grasp, but must endlessly repudiate in his own endless dissatisfaction in what he takes to be his successful hunt. He himself is the one who is hunted with terrible success by anxiety. In sloth, we fret at the inevitable realization that our existence is limited. We would rather things were different. We try to arrest the foot which brings us constantly nearer to this frontier. So in my book, I draw on the two atoms and try to give some type of guidance for how we ought to think about life extension. What I'm not doing, or what I didn't aim at doing in the book, is promoting fasting as somehow a more natural form of slowing aging. nor is this an attempt to kind of demythologize the Desert Fathers and put science behind what they were trying to say, but rather I tried to develop some type of theological lens looking at the first Adam in the garden and the last Adam, Jesus Christ, as twin focal points. So I do think that current attempts to manufacture a Methuselah pill might very well be described as the fruit of trogheit or sloth or both. And that the modern biomedical or Baconian project continues to minimize the moral significance of the body. I mean, we are encouraged to be managers now. I mean, recall the words of David Sinclair, like take control of your own aging, be responsible. You don't want to, you don't want someone caring for you when you fail. At the same time, yeah, greater longevity may indeed, beat the byproduct of fasting. We're really close. Some other things. I mean, there's deep ambiguities from a Christian perspective, right? To live as Christ, to die as gain. We're not talking about immortality here. We're talking about possibly, 15, maybe 20 years, maybe a few more, a finite number of healthy years. Is that necessarily wrong? If life is a gift from God, is that necessarily wrong? However, fasting may enable us to become the kinds of people who are less concerned about attaining a longer life. Slowing aging is obviously continues to be morally ambiguous. I didn't consider, Gil Meilander has done an excellent job of considering some of these things. What about the shape of a life? What about natality? What about having kids if you're extending your life? What are the social outcomes? There's answers for all these problems. I think we have cause to be very concerned with, given how we already treat the aged. I don't see a rosy picture developing in the future should life extending technology ever become a kind of over-the-counter pharmaceutical. I'm going to go back to something in the desert and freedom, and then that I think I ought to stop. Douglas Burton Christie also wrote about the life of Athanasius and what they were aiming for, what Anthony was aiming for. The telos, or the purpose of the monk's life in the desert, was freedom. Freedom from anxiety about the future, freedom from the tyranny of haunting memories of the past, freedom from an attachment to the ego, which precluded intimacy with others and with God. There's an irrevocable social component here. They hoped also that this freedom would express itself in a positive sense. Freedom to love others, freedom to enjoy the presence of God, freedom to live in the innocence of a new paradise. Well, that's all I have. Thank you for your patience.